Hello, everyone. My name is Millie.
My name is Nicole.
And welcome to this week's ÉCU Interns Chronicles. And today we're going to be talking about New York City and New York as a character. We're both from the U.S. I'm from Massachusetts.
I'm from New Jersey.
So relatively close to New York and New York City, but definitely not in the city. So you have a bit of an outsider and an insider perspective. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about was just how movies impact our perspectives of New York City. And like what movies, maybe what's the first movie you think of when you think of New York?
Films like King Kong, Spider-Man, superhero movies, although I live an hour away from New York, and these are very commercial films. I feel like a lot of New York films I don't really identify with, only because I don't know, I'm from New Jersey, but like these commercial films, that's what I think of because it's probably what I grew up watching on TV and films as a child. But I don't really identify with a lot of New York films, maybe because I didn't grow up there, but
well, it's interesting because you and I were sort of talking about it before we filmed this as well. Like, New York on film is different from New York in real life.
Yeah.
And like the New York on film, it's usually like a classic New York or even like an extravagant sort of like Wolf of Wall Street or The Devil Wears Prada.
Yeah.
Or something like that, where it's like, these are the upper elites. This is not, but then there's also something to be said for, as we were also talking about, like your Friends or those types of series like Friends or
Sex
in the City, which shows it a bit differently. I even also think of the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Like, it was just, it's kind of endless, but I don't know. I don't feel like any of it I'm like, oh, that's the real New York. Like, I'm always just kind of like, there's the fictional New York that exists in the movies.
Yeah.
And then there's the one that you might go visit. Because I've been to New York many times.
Yeah.
And it's a great city. And there's something very special about it. But even like times when you visit iconic locations that have been in films, it doesn't quite feel the same. Because we were talking about this with Paris as well.
Yeah.
And the Paris effect, because obviously ÉCU is in Paris.
Yeah.
And Paris has a very romantic sort of mysticism about it. And me as a kid, like growing up, and before I first came here for the first time, I remember just being like so excited to like walk down the streets as it's raining at night and like live in this sort of romantic place.
Yeah.
And while in many ways I still feel like that's true, it is very different at the same time. Like I was telling you, I went to the cafe where they shot Amelie.
Yeah.
Very different. Part of it is the fact like in the film, it's very vibrant, it's very camp, it's very stylized. But in real life, it's like right next to the Moulin Rouge.
Right.
So like not super, cute. But
yeah,
it was interesting. And it was a fun experience, but even one of my friends like took footage there, and after she edited it, it looked gorgeous. But I was like sitting there, I'm like, that's not what it looked like in real life.
Yeah.
New York is very similar.
For sure. I forgot about the film Moulin Rouge. When I listed a few films of Paris that I thought of when we were talking about this topic, and I obviously, a lot of people say this as well, Ratatouille, but also I listed down the film Hugo, and Hugo I watched when I was very little, and I just remember that I watched it so long ago I can't remember everything, but I just picture like this huge like clock and like just the architecture and how pretty like the streets were, and just the adventure of a kid being in Paris and their adventures, and I really loved that film. I really connected with it. I have no family in Paris or France or anything like that, but even films exactly like also the film Before Sunset, which is, I watched clips of that film as well. I watched it a long time ago, again I can't remember, but it's also like this idea that Paris is like the city of love and New York is like the city that never sleeps. Like you get these like sort of stereotypes.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I love that film Before Sunset. It takes place, I think the couple were initially from Vienna and went to Paris to like reconnect, and yeah, this idea of like love and film in Paris specifically is very interesting. Yeah.
That's really interesting how you bring in those two phrases, because when you look at like the film culture in both of those places, they're very like tied together. Like thinking about like New York being the city that never sleeps, and it's sort of like a darker undertone with that, where there is stuff like Sex in the City and like things where it's like bright and fun and sexy and cute, but it's not like the Parisian sort of like romantic love. It's like crime, dark. It's like,
For
like
sure.
thinking about the gangster films. Like I personally, like my family are Italian immigrants, so I connected with The Godfather and gangster films a lot.
Yeah.
Growing up, my great grandparents came through Ellis Island, like whole thing.
Yeah.
And so it's just really interesting, but it is that sort of darker. I don't know. Have you seen Daredevil?
I haven't seen Daredevil. Is it a gangster film?
No, it's a like superhero TV show, and it's like interesting because I believe it's set in New York. Don't quote me on it, but I believe it is. And it takes more of a gangster stylized aesthetic. And thinking about like superheroes, we're also talking about how like New York is sort of the like darker, or like Gotham is the darker version of New York. It takes more of like inspiration from physically from like Glasgow, but in reality it's a dark version of New York. And thinking about like the fact that it's just like you have your sort of not so superhero in Batman, who is like a good guy but also not always. He's still kind of morally gray sometimes. And you have all these insane villains. And when you think about, okay, here's the city based off of New York, and when you look at New York's sort of history of like violence and sort of sex and drugs and poverty and super wealth,
Yeah.
it's all just like extreme after extreme after extreme. And I think that kind of reflects the extremeness of the city in general.
For sure.
Like even architecture wise, like the skyscrapers, extreme. You don't get that in Paris.
But that's very true. Just the idea of extreme, as well as you were talking about money, sex, drugs, things like that, and gangster films, as well as like the idea of like New York being a city of like immigrants and things like that. I know the film In the Heights was by, I forgot who it was, Will Miranda. I forgot.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Yeah. I watched a few of that film and a few minutes of that film, and I really liked the idea how he played with the idea of immigrants and having a story that's based on like the story of New York, people who come from all these different places. And you talked about being an immigrant
Yeah.
from Italy,
Yeah.
from a family from Italy, and I just think that like films should be more representative of like immigrant stories and things like that. And I really love that film. You were mentioning the Spider-Man and Superman films that are centered in New York City. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I feel like it's very commercial. Again, I was mentioning this before. I don't really think it really represents, again, what New York really is.
Yeah.
Everyday New Yorker.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion. I feel like, again, films like Friends and these are series, Friends and Sex and the City may be closer to what people may be living in New York, but again, like, who gets a chance to live in New York? Like, 20-year-olds living in a...
Oh my God, yeah.
How nice would it be in Manhattan, but it's not really very common.
Yeah. One of my favorite things is when I watch like shows or TV series or whatever set in New York. And I say this with like my dad all the time because we'll be watching something and he'll be like, yeah, you could not afford that apartment with that budget. And it's always like so true, because the things we see on TV, it's like, oh, they had no jobs, yet they're in like this gorgeous apartment.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating because like when I have gone to New York, it has felt very different from what you see on the screen. And I don't know like how you can sort of bridge that gap, or if like there even is a point anymore, because like it does kind of go in circles. But I think we also wanted to talk about the fact New York in cinema faces a lot of destruction.
Oh yeah.
Like, especially superhero Marvel films or any action film, really. And a lot of them take place in New York, or at least sections of it do.
Yeah.
And they're always just under destruction. We're like buildings getting destroyed, cars set on fire, like insanity. And it made me sort of think, like, why New York? Because you don't see that happening in a film set in Paris, even though Paris has a lot of riots and different activist things like that, which, you know, that's part of the culture here.
Yeah.
But yet we don't have like major action films set in destroying it. And I wonder if there's something about New York's landscape or just like cinematic presence that like begs destruction.
I don't know, maybe because of like the buildings are so tall, and it just makes a really cool like environment for people to like, for action movies, and for people to like, I don't know, I might be because it's more modern, maybe, like,
Yeah.
city.
I do think as well, I'm just thinking of this as well, that could be contributing to it, is the fact like in Marvel films specifically, a lot of like the destruction, they say it's like a terrorist from like an alien terrorist. And like,
Yeah.
when we think about destruction in the US, really New York is the major victim of that.
Yeah.
So I think when the cinema is coming in and thinking, okay, what city would this likely happen in?
Yeah.
I guess New York, it is the most built up city. It is probably, I don't know if this is true, but probably one of the larger populations. It's definitely up there, but I don't know if it's the largest. Yeah, in the US.
In the U.S.
I don't know if it's the largest, but it's so delicate almost.
Yeah.
For being so strong, I feel like there's something about it that's very delicate
True.
that we see in film.
There's like no other place than New York, I feel like, but like there's so many people that come from so many different places. Obviously that is also in Paris and other cities as well, but I don't know, maybe it's just that iconic idea of New York, like
The melting pot.
the melting pot of people coming from everywhere, and just the architecture. I don't know, it might, yeah.
Yeah, I do think there is something to be said about New York that is different from like other US cities as well, because it was like one of the original just like immigration spots.
For sure.
And the US being a place that was kind of built on people from all over, it's its own thing, where like as in European cities, yes, of course there are immigrants, but it's not, there's still a long history of like, these are the people of that city.
Yeah.
Whereas New York, the city has always been its immigrants.
Very true.
And that's different from somewhere like LA even, because in LA, like people go west, but it's less like, well, at this point, LA is its own thing.
It's true.
Because it's like, it's now like either you're super wealthy or, so it's a whole,
Like there is like a lot of immigrants as well in other cities, obviously in the U.S. But I think just New York is just, I do believe it might be one of the like most populated cities in the U.S. I believe. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. I don't know what else to say about that. Yeah. We also talked about so we went over gangster films, the immigration side of things, but also you were talking about musicals. I mentioned in the Heights as well, and that's a sort of musical, and also talking about immigrants. But I mean, what musical did you mention before that you?
West Side Story.
Yes, you identified with them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was a musical theater kid, theater nerd. Can't help it. But I mean, Broadway is like this. Well, it is the center of American theater, and
Oh yeah.
so, I mean, there's always something about New York that I think has drawn the attention of movie musicals, like West Side Story, On the Town. Trying to think, Newsies, Thoroughly Modern Millie. Like, those are just some examples. Rent, 42nd Street, like all these different ones. But even in those examples, you have a common trend, which is people come to New York to escape. People come to escape something, or they're coming in as travelers. And they either find love or they find like destruction and disaster, because you have that sort of difference between, and I mean, this is just a theatrical trope, and you get it in movies all the time as well. But I mean, West Side Story is based off of Romeo and Juliet, but put into New York City. And again, you have those sort of conflicts of immigration and different communities and cultures fighting each other. And I think that's part of the city's just like essence at this point, is there is just so many different cultures, and there is always kind of a battle there. Yet there is also community and acceptance, like you see it in the Heights, where it's totally different. And Rent is also a great example, because when you think even differently, like not so much ethnic cultures, but like the queer community. Like you see that storyline a lot more in Rent, which again, I think New York also being a center for a lot of political movements, and like has always been something like that, where you see a lot of change and you see a lot of people from all around coming and creating communities. There is something born out of there that highlights differences but also brings people together.
For sure.
And that's one of the beautiful things. I also was just thinking about like Pose, which is a TV show based on like trans communities and the ballroom community, which is like a queer dancing experience. And I'm not gonna try and elaborate on that too much, because I don't know enough about it, but it's a great TV show. And it sort of follows like the different people who escape to New York and find their own family, and they find their own family of people like them, or people who can support them. And I think you see that a lot in New York's character.
For sure. I was thinking of the movie The Muppets, that take Manhattan.
Muppets Take Manhattan.
And just the idea of like New York being the Big Apple, like this huge city, the land of opportunity. And these little Muppets going around New York City, and
that's a much like brighter version of like some of these other ones, where it's like they follow their big dreams.
Basically. And I just find it that idea of like opportunity is also really big in New York too. A lot of people say, people go to New York to like follow their dreams and things like that, but also like the side of like another I guess idea that we've been talking about is also like power and money, and especially the financial district in like New York, like moving on from musicals, like films like The Wolf of Wall Street, and like the Wizard of Lies, that documented like the film, the financial I don't know how to call him, Madoff, and just this idea of power and opportunity is also really big in films like in New York City compared to like Paris. I believe. I mean, I might be wrong. I feel like people like films in Paris, I'm generalizing, but they tend to follow like this romanticized idea of Paris, and like again, just being young and falling in love, and this is a stereotype, but in the perception of someone who hasn't watched a lot of films from France or Paris and hasn't lived here, that's what I perceive from an American side,
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said just about different filmmaking cultures. Like in France, like, I mean, I mostly associate French cinema with the Nouvelle Vague, which was the French New Wave, which follows like very specific aesthetics, and it follows it's more of like it's kind of notable. They like have like a lot of in the streets scenes, and it's more of a internal, but also it's more introspective, yet also very like straightforward. And it kind of follows the stories of more regular people, I think.
Okay.
Whereas American cinema culture, at the same time as the Nouvelle Vague was going on, it was still like big Hollywood.
Yeah.
So it's just very different. And I think that has an effect on our cities, which are portrayed, because in many ways, like, I mean, I don't know if you've seen The American in Paris as well.
The American in Paris.
It's a musical as well, starring Gene Kelly. And that's another example of, like, the Hollywoodized Paris is very different from the French Paris.
Even Emily in Paris, that's what I was
Emily in Paris, yeah.
That's what you're talking about. Yeah, very much, yeah, the idea, the Americanized version of Paris, and what, Americans experience and their view of Paris, and not the authentic Paris, but
because I feel like we sort of naturally show the darker sides of the cities we understand, because cities in general are dark. There's so many things going on in them. They are beautiful and beautiful places, but there's also always going to be some undertones there. And Paris, from an American perspective, it's the cultural epicenter of the world. It's museums, it's Versailles, it's the Eiffel Tower. It's like gorgeous. You walk along the Seine and drinking coffee and wine. But that's the American version. But then you have, like, what the French actually see it as, and it's slightly different. But there's still a bit more of a pride and respect for the cities that I feel like maybe Americans don't have, because we come from such a large country where it's like, I don't know if I'd have as much pride or respect for New York other than see how it can be used as this sort of aura.
Yeah.
But like me from Boston, I think there's a bit more of like a tenderness I have for Boston, where I'm like, I want it to be seen for its like cool values, as well as also what it can be used for in the dark stuff.
I completely agree. We also have to like mention like the start of film was by the Lumiere brothers and with Paris. So and maybe my perception of film is only the American side of that, and I don't really see the authentic French experience through film, maybe because I'm not from here or I just haven't seen those films. But yeah, we definitely have to mention that.
Thanks so much for listening. See you next week on the podcast. Well, we won't, but you'll see someone.
Thank you.
Bye.